The EAL Nexus project, as many of you know, was set up just over a year ago. For the first time, the British Council decided they needed to look at provision for English language teaching in the UK after many very successful years as a global provider of English language teacher education. And I was appointed initially to work 2 days a week to do an audit of provision and practice to inform the beginning of the EAL Nexus project. It was not an audit of training provision. It was literally an audit of what is going on across the UK in 2013 and early 2014. And that's really what I am reporting on. A part of that audit included looking at aspects of training. And so I've pulled out from the whole audit the bits that I think are most relevant for this context. I was doing this on my own, and it's not a large, wide-scale, quantitative survey like the NALDIC survey. I realised I couldn't possibly cover such a wide range of institutions, for example, as they've managed to draw into their survey. So my study was a lot more small scale and a lot more qualitative. I actually wanted to get into schools and talk to teachers, but I didn't want to do what NALDIC were doing. I wanted to do something different. And I very much wanted to get a snapshot of what was actually going on at school level and look at perhaps the users of the training more than anything else. So the initial audit was going to provide a snapshot. And it's not just England. The British Council works nationally and includes Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I did a lot of in-depth telephone interviews with local authorities, and I visited 17 schools. And the schools that I was most interested in looking at were those that had lower numbers of EAL learners. I think we already know an awful lot about urban schools. I think the national strategies put most of their resources into urban schools, and I was particularly interested to see what was happening to teachers of EAL learners in parts of the country that perhaps other people hadn't reached. And so what I'm reporting on is a very particular type of school, I think. And I know a lot of you come from London and are teachers in London schools, so what I'm saying may not match with your own experience. I spent a lot of time looking for EAL teams, and as Nicola said about the NALDIC, that they found that there was quite a loss of EAL teams and EAL expertise across the local authorities, and that was very much what I found. One thing I must say before I go on, because I think a lot of what I found was you will see was not entirely positive. Everywhere I found that teachers and head teachers were really keen to talk to me, really interested to hear that the British Council was going to get involved in EAL, and really wanting to know more about were they doing the right thing, could they get some training from somewhere. People just picked my brains everywhere, because I often turned up in a school where they had had no EAL training or advice ever before. And it was like I was this rare, precious thing. So it was quite hard for me just to be a researcher, because they asked me as many questions as I asked them. But in terms of the local authority provision, as NALDIC found and as Nicola has said, the effect of the cuts has been quite severe, particularly in England, in the last 4 years. And there are, I think, now about 40 English authorities where there is now no EAL consultant, nobody available to provide any EAL training at all. In Scotland and Wales, the situation is okay at the moment, but not for much longer as far as we can tell. The Welsh Government is already consulting on restructuring, and there's talk about cuts in the grant. So the local authorities in Wales, I was speaking to one yesterday, are very concerned about what's going to happen in the future and whether the few jobs that remain are going to continue. The same is the case in Scotland. Pretty much every local authority right across the UK, people's jobs and positions as EAL specialist trainers are at risk. I think the other thing that came very, very strongly from my conversations was, even in the authorities where there were people, they were incredibly pressurised. You know, they might have had to work perhaps with 5 secondary schools and a dozen primaries in the past that had the majority of the EAL learners in their authority. But what is happening now is, because of the migration patterns, there are 300 schools in an authority that want advice and support and training. So the actual demand has increased hugely. And it's not just about the pupils, which I think Diana showed you a graph about the pupil numbers. It's the dispersal of those pupils into areas of the country that have never had EAL learners before. And that is acute in places like Wales and Northern Ireland. I mean, the EAL population in Wales has doubled, but it's gone from 3% to 7%, something like that. So it's still highly dispersed. I found a really interesting fact that Polish is now spoken in every council ward in England and Wales except 2. So there are Polish speakers absolutely everywhere. So every tiny village school in the middle of Cornwall or Suffolk could get a speaker of an EAL speaker into their school. And I think it's that really worries me most of all. It is absolutely a national issue, it's not an urban issue. And I think so much seems to be concentrated around London and Manchester and Leeds and places like that, that these small village schools who have had no contact with training or consultancy or advice, or, are not getting anything now. A lot of the local authorities that do still have staff are managing to provide some support still to primary schools, but it's the secondary schools that are really finding it difficult to access high quality training, to know where to go to get it, which matches very much what Nicola's saying about the accreditation issue. And as I say, often buying in people who make wonderful claims about what they're going to do and then not being entirely happy about what they get. It's very variable. Just a little map there where I've sort of highlighted some of the local authorities where there is no free at the point of need EAL specialist. There may be a traded service in some of these places. There seems to be a bit of an issue in Middle England in particular, actually, which is quite interesting. I think this feeds into the political debate, of course. And there's a huge variability. Newham, Tower Hamlets, places like that has 60-70% of EAL learners. There may not be a local authority provision in terms of consultancy, but the schools themselves have excellent practice. The schools have highly experienced EAL coordinators who have already done their master's degrees. Whereas you've got other small shire authorities where there might be one EAL teacher advisor covering 300 schools and having to drive for 2 to 3 hours from one end of the county to the other. So a huge variability. As I say, there are some authorities where I'm particularly concerned where there might be quite a large bilingual population, but absolutely nobody providing advice and training in those authorities. I think it would be a really interesting piece of research actually to start to look at actual pupil outcomes, EAL numbers, and local authority training provision. Do some sort of correlation. I'm afraid my use of data is not good enough to do it. It would be an interesting one. So what are some of the key themes? What I saw in primary schools was always better than what I saw in secondary schools, basically. Primary teachers are thinking about language and literacy all day long, and it shows. Yeah? And whilst I didn't see many primary teachers drawing on the first languages of children, unfortunately, I did feel that at least they were conscious of what they were doing in terms of developing children's language. The contrast often between the primary and its local secondary school was really scary. I went to a town in mid Wales. I went to a really wonderful primary school. I felt the practice was incredibly strong. The head teacher was able to talk very confidently about what she was doing for the EAL pupils. I could see it all around the school. I then went the next day to the secondary school. So those pupils were moving up to that adjacent secondary school, and it was deeply depressing and dispiriting what was going on in the secondary school, that they were having a really rich, bilingual, language-aware diet in the junior school, but this was not sustained at all in the secondary school. There was a teacher working in the SEN department with a load of ELT textbooks, sitting in a corner, helping one child with his English homework, and that was it. And I found a similar pattern in another authority just outside London, actually, where the primary school was doing incredibly well for the bilingual pupils, but the secondary school, who was basically taking on those pupils, there was one EAL teacher working hugely under pressure, having no professional development support and feeling quite isolated. The focus on beginners, I think, again, Nicola has picked up on this from the NALDIC survey, it is also considerable. Schools don't ask for training for more advanced learners very often. They still, after all these years, talk about beginners. And I think as soon as you sit down with leadership and point out the fact that actually there are gaps in the achievement at Key Stage 2, for the more advanced learners, or Key Stage 4 for the more advanced learners, they can see it. But I feel quite strongly we need to use the data to actually find a way of getting schools to focus otherwise, which again kind of links quite clearly with this directed training towards different roles in terms of leadership and management of EAL.